Welcome to episode 29 of the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. Today, we are planning to take a good look at the excellent question of how do I know, or how do I discern who to trust? And kind of specifically when we mean like who to trust for information on the body and movement. That's kind of like the specific lens that we're taking with the specific focus of our podcast. But within the wide and vast sea of information that is always coming at us, and all the conflicting information and opinions and beliefs that are just always coming across the path that we're tuning into, how do we have some productive tools to kind of hone in and get a sense of which sources of information, which people who are sharing information are maybe a little more likely to be more trustworthy and maybe more evidence-based than other people? And this seems like a really important question, and one that I feel is really kind of integral to kind of Travis's and my whole work together and everything we do with this podcast as well. But just doing our best to try to share ideas and tips for how to take a more science-based or evidence-based approach and perspective on whatever it is we do. But we know that specifically, like our audience, we're thinking yoga and movement, maybe fitness, and also maybe expanding that to the rehabilitation or the therapeutic realm. There's maybe some crossover there. So this question of how do I know who to trust is one that Travis and I actually tend to get quite a bit. I personally have gotten this question from multiple people in just the past week or so. I don't know if there's something in the air, but I think it's something that really comes up for people a lot when they realize, and this frequently happens, when we realize that something that we've been taught that we used to believe was true, we maybe learn more information and then we look back and realize what we were taught before isn't necessarily evidence-based or supported. And then that can send us to feeling many different ways, and especially just confused. I thought I could trust that source. How do I know who and what to trust moving forward now that clearly I was wrong to trust them? So anyway, that's what this episode is about. And our plan today, just kind of a general outline for what we're planning to focus on, is kind of beginning with just some tips for how to think scientifically, just in general, how to maybe be a more critical thinker. So tips for that. A look at some common biases that we all fall prey to just by the nature of our being human and the way that our brains work. But the more we're aware of these biases, the more we can try to recognize them when they happen and try to move away from them. And what types of signs to look for when trying to discern whether the information that you're hearing from someone seems to be credible or evidence-based. And just to reiterate that, again, we're kind of looking at this today through kind of our specific focus of yoga, movement, maybe rehab worlds. But a lot of the tips that we'll be talking about today, especially for just how to think more scientifically in general, they apply to just everything across the board as far as just modern daily life and all the information we're taking in all realms, right? And that comes at us through social media, the media in general, blog posts, the news, just everywhere. So yeah, so how can we kind of incorporate just some tips that Travis and I would like to offer to kind of hone in and know what's maybe more trustworthy and what we can just disregard. So that is our plan for today. And I know that I personally have felt confused, and still the times will come out where I will feel confused about all of this. Travis, do you agree, or have you experienced, or do you have people come to you who seem just confused about how do I know who to trust?
Sure. Well, I teach undergrad exercise science students, so I feel like I'm trying to foster these skills in my students.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's especially salient, coming off of a global pandemic, right?
Yes,
these skills are transferable. So although we're talking about exercise and yoga and movement and maybe a little bit of rehab, you can see how those relate to one another. But if you have that, I call it like my bullshit meter, but
Yes, yes,
if
totally.
you can discern fact from fiction, good information from bad information, that's going to be useful in many different realms. And
Yeah.
I've gone through this process on my own, and like you said, I'm still certainly going through it. It's a never ending process, but I feel like in 2022 I'm better at discerning
Hmm.
good and bad information than I was 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Do you think it's something that like we get better at with practice?
I hope so. Maybe I'm getting worse, but
No, I'm
yeah,
sure,
I mean,
I'm
I
sure
think
you are
I
not getting
think
worse now.
I think practice for sure. I think
Hmm.
scientific training. I mean, I like
Yeah,
in those last 5 years, I did my PhD. In the last 10 years, I did an undergraduate degree and a master's degree, as well as
100%.
personal training school. So, been exposed to a lot of both good information and not as good information, but in school and outside of school, like from all of the outlets that you mentioned.
That we all tune
Well, and
into,
that's
right?
that's the especially hard part. Like, you're going to come across some fluff on the internet, but what about when you're coming across information that you believe to be not as up to date as it could be, like in school, for example?
Like in
That's
actual
a tough.
school, in
Yeah,
textbooks.
I know in the physical therapy school circles that I run in, like
Hmm.
some students are sometimes frustrated if they've been exposed to more of this critical thinking, evidence-based crowd, and then they're in PT school and they're
Yeah,
finding that isn't the people who are teaching the courses there maybe aren't in tune with the same sorts of things. Like, that's a tough position to be in.
absolutely. And like, how do you reconcile all of that?
Yeah,
Yeah. So I think I guess we hope to kind of look at that today, and also some ideas of when you find yourself in a situation like that where you're actively being taught maybe outdated ideas and you
yeah,
realize that in the moment, or maybe after the fact, you realize later, you look back that as disappointing as that might sound, there also can be a bright side that we kind of want to talk about today.
yeah.
Um, but hey, before we get to that, or maybe just kind of mixed in with getting to that, we were thinking that we might just like share a couple of our own personal experiences with dealing with this in our own past and learning. Travis, do you want to start us off with like sharing just like an example from your past where you feel like
Sure.
you learned some outdated
Yeah,
info?
yeah. So the examples that come to mind for me are when I was in personal training school. I had a really great mentor, and at the time I didn't know anything. I was going and doing this diploma in personal training, and so I really looked up to this great
Mm-hmm.
mentor that I had, and I took at face value what he taught. And for the most part,
Right.
he was up to date. He had so much experience working as a personal trainer himself in
Right.
the field for
Super
many, many years.
established.
Yeah. And so anything that he picked up along the way, like, you could take to the bank because that's worked for him with real people for a long time. But not everybody can be right 100% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I, years after the fact, well, this has actually been a forever evolution afterwards. There were certain things that I learned that I realized, or am realizing, were not quite as up to date as they could have been.
Mm-hmm.
And at at the time in 2012, 2013, they might have been more accepted, but now 10 years later, they are, some people still believe these things, and it's everything that we talk about on the podcast, quite frankly.
Right.
But
A lot of stuff
uh,
we've debunked on. Yeah.
yeah, it's like these things that were believed to be true by most people at the time are still believed to be true by many people, but the science has come to show whatever,
Hmm.
anterior pelvic tilt, lower cross syndrome, upper cross syndrome,
Muscle
all the postural
imbalances.
stuff, all the muscle imbalances. Those are all the things that were in the textbook that we used in personal training school And then we're taught to us, this muscle is short, this muscle is long, this muscle needs to be activated, this muscle is sleepy, dormant, whatever. So, you know, you're taught these things and you
Mm-hmm.
believe them to be true because you have no reason not to. And then over the course of going and doing further schooling and exposing myself to other training philosophies and other educators, I had
Right.
some hard realizations. You know, I had started a blog shortly after finishing my personal training diploma. I was putting out I was kind of regurgitating some
Mm-hmm.
information, maybe with my own spin on it. But if you look back, or if I look back on my old blog posts from 2013, I'm spewing a lot of this outdated
Right.
or incomplete or incorrect information. And I got pushback from smart people. And I
Yeah.
appreciate that, because when you put your ideas out there, you're subjecting yourself to feedback. And when people were telling me, like, that's not quite right, that's not what the science is
Mm-hmm.
really
Mm-hmm.
showing, that was like a hard thing for me to reconcile.
Yeah.
Because the immediate response was, well, I learned this from somebody that I really respect.
Totally.
I could I one possibility when you're put it in that situation, you can just double down, right? And they call that the backfire effect, where you're not open to any other perspectives. You
Mm-hmm.
just it pushes you even further, entrenches you into the thing that you believe.
Yeah.
Or I once I started to like get exposed to some other ideas, it was uncomfortable. I wrestled with it and
Mm-hmm.
I finally realized, like, oh, I need to really deliberately expose myself to completely different ideas from these other people,
Yeah.
like give myself some other perspectives and exposure, because there's another side to this story. So
Right.
that was, like I said, that was initially something that I started experiencing a few years out from personal training school. And then now, over the 8 years after that, it's like a constant evolution of like encountering these beliefs that maybe I hadn't challenged before. And then thinking about, well, where did I hear this? Why did I believe it at the time? Why did the person who told it to me believe it at the time? And do I still think that this is true? Could it not be true? What does it all mean?
Right. And uh it sounds like you actually, I would say, and I think this is not super common with everyone, but when you were starting to have some of your beliefs challenged by like other smart people, it sounds like instead of doubling down and just like sticking back with the authority that you had learned from, you let yourself be open to, and even though that was uncomfortable and probably entailed like you'd have to learn more and you'd have to, reframe and just change and update your approach. Like that's a lot of work. No one wants to really do that
Yeah.
in one sense, but you were open to it. And I think that's amazing and kind of rare. It's just so much easier to take the other path.
Yeah. Well, like a case in point, I wrote a blog post about anterior pelvic tilt, and I wrote
Mhm.
6 exercises you could do to quote unquote correct your anterior
Fix.
pelvic tilt or fix it or whatever. And I got pushback like, hey, Travis, this isn't right. Anterior pelvic tilt isn't causing the things that you mentioned, blah, blah, blah.
Hmm.
I spent another day updating the blog post. So, reading the
Hmm.
studies that had been sent to me, trying to wrap my head around this so that I could make sure that the information that I was putting out wasn't wrong. So, instead of just saying, well, if your static posture is in an anterior pelvic tilt, you need to do these 6 exercises. I said, like, here are 6 exercises that you can do. But because there were good exercises, but the justification for them originally was off. And
Right.
I wanted to make sure I was meticulous about not being wrong. Hate being
Yeah.
wrong. So
Misleading. Yeah.
yeah, so I spent an extra day uh, making, like, going back and updating the article blog post so that it was not incorrect anymore.
And
And
I
that's
think,
just like extra work that most people would be like, screw it. Like, I don't care what's right. I just need to put
right.
something out there. It's done. And
Yeah.
that wasn't
I don't
how
want to
I
put any more
approached it.
work into that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I spent another day working on it.
Well, I really admire that that would be your approach, even though it did entail more work and effort. But I think that's like the in integrity thing to do, you know, either update the information you're putting out there or take it down, like stop putting it
Yeah.
out there, whatever,
Yeah. I guess
once you realize.
uh, what's that fallacy called? The sunk cost.
Sunk cost fallacy, that's a good one.
I
What's
didn't want
that,
to,
Travis? What's the sunk cost fallacy?
when you've already spent so much time on something that
Oh, and
you
money,
feel,
right?
yeah, time or money or resources or whatever, that you feel like you can't abandon it. So you
Like you're like obligated
continue,
or
yeah,
something.
you continue to spend more. So a good example of this would be like if you're at a movie, you've purchased the tickets for the movie, you're at the movie, you realize that you don't like it, like you're
Right,
actively
like
not
part way
enjoying it.
in.
Yeah, you've already spent the money, you should just leave. Like you're not going to get the money
Right.
back, rather than subjecting yourself to another hour of unenjoyment. Like just walk out. Nobody ever does that, right?
That's right.
um
Yeah.
or at least I don't. I stay and suffer, but
Right. But I think that is I'm glad because I know we maybe wanted to touch on some common fallacies like today as we're, you know, trying to talk about how to think more scientifically. So as they come up, I think it's good that we identify them. And that's a good one. I see that one often in the yoga world as well. Like, you know, we invested time and money in some big training that we like got certified in with 3 letters or something. And then maybe later we find out that that training or the system is questioned by evidence, but it's just like, well, I already invested. It's like not worth it to me. You know, I'm sunk. I'm in that. I'm just going to
yeah.
stick with that.
Well,
You know,
that's
it's
how I
easy to
felt.
do.
Yeah, that's how I felt, having gone through that training and then being mentored by other people, all coming from the same school of thought. It's like, well, I've already invested so much in this, of, you know, of my
Yeah.
time and my belief landscape, that it's really hard to say, oh, well, I'm going to go totally the other way.
Right, right. But you did manage to, and I think like one of the things we wanted to talk about today, which was like looking at the bright side of when we realize that we've been taught, you know, maybe outdated information or pseudoscience, things like this. One of the bright sides of that is that like if you today realize that in the past you were taught something that was outdated or incorrect, it might feel really frustrating, but at the same time, if we want to take a positive look on it, it's actually something to feel good about because it means that you have evolved, you have changed. Like if previously you were taught and you believed something that was like pseudoscientific, that means that back then in that moment, you didn't discern that information. Like you didn't discern well enough to not take in that information as true. Like you didn't question it. You just like, I believe this person is teaching me. I'm just going to go with it.
Hmm.
And the fact that today you now no longer hold those beliefs and you look back and realize like I was wrong, what that information that was taught to me was wrong. It means that today, now in this moment, you've evolved and you've become a more critical thinker. So that's actually a good thing, right? Like we could celebrate,
Totally.
right? That we've learned more. I mean, it's
Yeah.
so easy to just be like, I'm really angry about what I was taught, but maybe we could just like look at ourselves and our own evolution and process.
Yeah. But on the flip side, if you still believe everything that you believed from 20 years ago, maybe you should
Yeah.
look in the mirror and wonder
Because
about
science is
why
always
you're not
evolving.
evolving. Right.
Yeah, 100%. And then another thing that I feel like I got from hearing your story about your experience is that it also gave you the opportunity to kind of look at how you choose to think about information and what sources you consider as authoritative and like how do you know what you know? Why do you believe what you believe? Do you believe what you believe because just someone that you looked up to taught you that and you were just like, well, they're an authority. I consider them authority, so I'll just believe what they say. Like it just
Hmm.
gives us the chance, and I feel like it gave you the chance to really self-examine and
Right.
have some time for some introspection, and that resulted
Yeah.
in a shifted and better perspective on how to take in information, right?
Yeah. Once you have a few occasions where those beliefs are getting challenged, that's a good domino to get the ball rolling, to be like, oh, I need to really think about
Hmm.
everything that I think about, and think about why I think about it, and
Yeah, so it's a good
go through that
opportunity for
process.
that.
Right.
Yeah. Well, can I share about my
Yeah.
personal experience with
What
having
was
learned some?
yours?
And I think mine will actually speak to another element of how we can look at all of this from a bright side perspective as well. Like, it doesn't have to be all bad. But I'd say like the most impactful example for me was once I started teaching yoga. I practiced yoga for 10 years or so before I started teaching, and then I started teaching, and I felt when I started, I was like, well, I practiced forever. I feel really ready to like teach, like I'm there. But once I actually commenced teaching other people moving their bodies through space, I started to realize pretty quickly that I had a big lack in knowledge as far as really understanding the human body and movement. And what I had learned through my yoga studies just hadn't really taught me what I would want to know in that realm. So once I started realizing this like lack of knowledge and confidence in understanding that, I started to look for other sources. Like, how can I learn more? And I remember at that time, and we're talking, I don't know, 2012-ish, something like around similar, I think, to kind of what you're describing as your time. I looked around for like, where can I learn more about alignment? Like, I really wanted to know more about alignment. Back then, I just thought that was really important. Like, how can I
Yeah.
teach my students the right alignment that's going to keep their bodies safe? Like, I feel like yoga traditionally doesn't really do a good job of that, or maybe there's some quote bad alignment in yoga. And I just want to know the right alignment, and like, I want to study that. So I Googled around for that, and I found this whole training with like a certification where this person who the person who started the whole system, it's a system with the brand, she's a biomechanist. So she has her master's in biomechanics.
Whatever that means.
Yeah, right. But
She
to
has a
me,
master's in
she
biomechanics,
has a
and
master's
I
in
think
bio.
it's
Yeah.
okay to call her a biomechanist.
And she called herself a biomechanist. Yeah. And that was her like, that was her credentials. And to me, I was like, oh my gosh, she knows biomechanics. She teaches about alignment. Like, I can't wait to learn. And it actually turned out that this person has like it's like a national, maybe even an international reach as far as this program. But at that time, it's not the case anymore. But at that time, the program was rooted. She lived really close to where I lived in
Oh,
Santa Barbara. So I was able to actually travel. Well, it was like 20, 30 minutes, not really travel in one sense. But anyway, I was able to go there and study in person and take this program in person before she ended up leaving the area. So I did that program, and it taught me so much. It was all about like proper alignment and proper mechanics, and how to like we had all these like quote alignment points in everybody's body that we had to like line ourselves up like against a plumb line and check all these points for not only, a pain-free body, but also just an optimally well body in general. Like, there were these ideas that your alignment could be connected to health outcomes and things like that beyond just pain. So anyway, I learned all of that, and then and then along with the getting your body in proper alignment, there are also a whole selection of corrective exercises that we were taught. You know
mm,
corrective exercises, right, Travis?
I know them well. This jibes with my experience I was talking
I
about
kind of
before
feel
too.
like that too, from what I know of your experience with that personal training school. Yeah, these corrective exercises that we're taught, like as movement teachers, that we can teach people to like correct these quote dysfunctions or
Dysfunctions.
imbalances.
Hmm.
Yeah, that we as a movement teacher are somehow qualified to like diagnose and treat. Which
Of course.
back then I was like, yeah, I can diagnose it. But today I'm like, that's out of scope for a movement teacher who's not also like a medical professional. I
Yeah.
believe trying to diagnose, dysfunction and treat and diagnose. I don't really think that's within the realm of, at least as
Right.
me as a young teacher. So anyway, but back then I thought it was. And so yeah, we had this whole selection of corrective exercises, and it was great because I taught yoga. So I just integrated a lot of those corrective exercises into my yoga asana classes. I would just bring them in, and when I taught them, I would use language to my students about how like this movement that I'm teaching you here, this is like correcting or fixing this imbalance in your body that's going to, prevent you from or cure you from or treat some
Wow.
pain. Yeah, these are because it's just what I had learned. I didn't know she was a biomechanist. I was like,
Yeah.
that's my authority.
Were the other students yoga teachers,
That's
personal
a great
trainers?
question. It was a mix. It was a mix of there were some yoga teachers. There were yeah, I think there were personal trainers. A very small handful. Like, there was an occasional physical therapist or two. I
Mhm.
remember chiropractors being
Mhm.
in there. And then also a lot of people who were not movement teachers at all, but were just interested for themselves. Like they had heard of this work. They maybe had pain in their body. They wanted to learn how to align better. But in order to take the program, they also were trained how to teach people, like how to teach people how to get into alignment and how to do these corrective exercises. So there were people who were not
Interesting.
movement teachers also certifying in it.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I was gonna say as I was reflecting about this, I do have a memory that I want to say I'm a little ashamed to admit, but I'm not because it shows that I wouldn't do this today. But I, like you, I also wrote blog posts and articles that I put out there in the internet that were just my source was this training. I just believed that this was what was true. I
Mhm.
remember it's a kind of opposite blog post. You said you wrote a blog post about anterior pelvic tilt and how to like exercises to get out of it or treat it.
Right, right.
I wrote a blog post that was more about posterior
No
pelvic tilt, which
way.
is being tucked under, because in our training we were taught that everybody tucks under and that causes all this dysfunction. So I wrote a
It's a
post
perfect
about that.
example.
This is so funny. And I remember that, of course, I got a lot of comments where people were like, yeah, that's good to know. But some people questioned me. And I remember specifically like someone who seemed smart posted a link to a study where she was like, what do you say then about this study that shows that the average person is actually in an anterior pelvic tilt? Like, it's anterior pelvic tilt is normal and is the most common, like not posterior. Because I think in my article, I was claiming that everybody was in a posterior tilt. I remember when she posted that, it just for me maybe was cognitive dissonance, if that's the right word. I was just like, I
Totally.
can't really take that in because my teacher is a biomechanist and this is what she taught me. So I think I
Yes.
just like ignored the comments. I would not do that today, but this is me back then. So
Wow.
anyway, yeah, I guess a bright side to me for having, because we do also want to kind of emphasize the bright side, is that I feel like along with outdated and misinformation that I learned in that training, along with that, I also learned a lot of good information. I learned a lot about anatomy and a lot about just like movement, just just basic without having to layer on like ideas about dysfunction and health, but just simply how the body
Yeah,
moves,
totally.
right? Like I learned it. It's not like it's all 100% to be
Right.
just
Well,
like brushed aside.
yeah, like the anatomy knowledge that I have, I didn't major in exercise science as an
Oh,
undergraduate.
that's
So the
right.
anatomy and knowledge that I have mostly comes from personal training school, and now I teach exercise science.
Isn't
So
that funny? Yeah.
like yeah, I took an anatomy and physiology class in grad school, but
Mm-hmm.
only one.
Mm-hmm.
So I have my foundation really does come from that 500-hour diploma. So like you said,
Mm-hmm.
you just take the good and the bad.
Exactly. And I think, yeah, that's just a good way we don't want to, we're already done with the training. We did it. We don't necessarily need to be like, I wish I'd never done that because you did it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
part of who you are today. But there are pluses, right?
Yeah. And mine was way more positive than negative. Yours
Yeah.
maybe
Mine,
sounds like a bit of a mixed bag,
yeah. Yeah. I would,
but
to be honest. Yeah.
yeah, like I
But
don't
it's
regret.
fine.
Yeah.
You don't regret.
No,
Yeah.
not in the slightest. And maybe you don't either.
I'm glad you asked that because I was just about to say I don't
Yeah.
regret actually.
Yeah.
I think it actually helped propel me forward on my movement path and my teaching
Yeah.
path.
Even if it was the wrong direction, if now you can go
Exactly.
back and be like, well, that's what not to do. And
Precisely. And then
sometimes
we
that's
can
helpful.
totally, then we can have this podcast. Like
Yeah.
the overarching yoga meets movement science, but even this specific episode, because I've been through all that. And you've been
There
through
you
what you've
go.
been through.
It's all justified now because we can talk about it in this episode.
Ex-
But
yes,
obviously, you talk about this like this is a theme that runs through all of your
right.
teaching, like the misinformation potentially that you learned. Then it's like, well, here's what not to
Right.
do. Here's what not to do. Here's what not to do. So that's helpful.
Totally. Yeah, it is. Right. Because, oh, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That was another point about why we want to look on the bright side about having learned outdated
Oh
info.
yeah,
Is that right? Um, when we realized we were taught outdated info, at least that helps us have a better sense of the landscape of ideas that are out there. Right,
yeah.
Travis?
Well, it's funny. Like I joke about this. So I teach undergrad exercise science students, most of whom, or many of whom, are going to be future physical therapists. And
Right.
so I perceive, having been around the block, I learned all these outdated things. I have now updated my beliefs, and I try to instill these updated beliefs and narratives into my students who are
Yes.
just receiving this information very early on in their academic careers. So they haven't heard the bad to then hear the
That's
good,
right.
to then be like, well, I heard the bad and now I'm hearing the good, and like have that experience of cognitive dissonance. So
Yeah.
if I'm only giving them I try to only give them the newest and most up to date and evidence based information. They don't ever have that experience potentially.
Mm-hmm.
So like they're not realizing, they don't get that experience of, I heard this, now I'm hearing this. So on the one hand, that's good, but on the other hand, like they don't, that's not, that may not be a process that they go through if all they ever hear is the up to date information. So it's just, but they don't recognize that maybe I'm more up to date than other people. So it's funny to think about.
Right. Right.
Like they, hopefully I can, help them avoid going down that path to then come back to a better path, like saving them a couple of years of that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
we shall
And
see.
would you also suggest, Travis, that maybe in educating your students about the common myths that are out there also might help them understand for their future patients when their patients come in or clients come in with these ideas about how pain works that are maybe outdated? Maybe if these when they are physical therapists later, when they realize like what general society believes about these things, they can then maybe relate to their patients in a more productive way because they understand like where they're getting these ideas or
Right.
where
Well,
it's
yeah. So, but that's the interesting idea, right? If you and I heard the wrong information, then relearned the correct information, we can easily relate to people who come to us still earlier on in the learning process.
yeah
But if you only ever learn the
the
correct
new
information, yeah, then maybe you're not as well equipped to talk to people who are like, why the heck would you think, you know
yeah
why would you believe the biomedical model when we have the biopsychosocial model?
right. But in general it just seems like it's a positive to have an understanding of the information and the misinformation that's out there. I feel like if we want to
Right.
relate with people and especially if we want to educate them, like be educators.
Yes.
So it's good, it's good that both you and I had these past experiences, and I'm sure many of our listeners can relate to like what we shared. But anyway, what do you think about establishing just a couple, like going over a couple of terms and definitions
Hmm.
when it comes to like thinking scientifically and just in general, this like broad look we're taking at this topic? We had a couple terms we wanted to address here, which were pseudoscience and outdated beliefs,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Because I feel like these terms are used quite frequently. I think most people have like a sense of what they mean, but it just might be nice to kind of define them so we're a little
Yeah, and another
comfortable.
related one that I often hear is bro science.
Oh, bros! I that is that common kind of like in the fitness world or the lifting
Yeah,
world.
yeah, but
What's bro
it's the same.
science?
It's the same thing as pseudoscience, just applied to perhaps bodybuilding context or fitness context.
That makes so I could be wrong. I had this like superficial impression that bro science also like was what you said, but also was kind of like an emphasis on people placing priority on their experience more than
Yeah,
like on actual, like, well, I lifted this way and this happened to me, and so that's my
yeah,
my n equals
that's
one,
true.
or if you're
That's
a
true.
trainer, you have like your applied experience, like, well, science
Yes,
says this, but I do this.
it could have a positive or negative connotation. But to your point, it's very much experience based. Like, well,
Right,
I learned this, or I figured this out, quote unquote, in the trenches,
right, in the
working
trenches,
with real
yeah.
clients. And uh, as a corollary, I'm ahead of the research. Uh,
Oh, right, like that's what they would say, what a bro science
yeah,
person would say. That's right. It's like
perhaps.
pre-science or
Yeah, or
something. That's
I don't need to listen to the research because I've figured this out
yeah,
in my own
in my own
lab in the
experience.
gym.
That's right. So yeah, and I think I believe you would suggest that like experience is important when people are making like decisions about, I don't know, how to
Yeah,
prescribe exercise or
it's
how to treat.
absolutely a type of evidence.
Yeah, it's a type, right, but it's just like not the whole picture, right? Like
Hmm.
there's
Mhm.
also, yeah, evidence from actual research.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so maybe to your point, it's not exactly the same thing as pseudoscience. Pseudoscience has a largely negative connotation. Bro science maybe has a mix of, it could be negative, but it could also be okay. It's just, this is your anecdotal experience.
Oh, yeah, that's a
That's your
good way
bro
to put
science.
it. Yeah, yeah. Because Travis, you actually mentioned a term that actually would be good to define too. You said bro science is often like anecdotal evidence. Could you tell
Yeah.
us what's an anecdote and what's anecdotal evidence?
Right. So anecdote is
In case
just,
people, if people don't know.
anecdote would be your experience. So my
Mm-hmm.
experience, any when we'd say n equals one, that would be like with myself, or maybe with
Mm-hmm.
one case, like one client. This is what happened. Therefore, the fallacy is extending that to say, well, this is what's always going to happen with everybody, and
Right.
that can be
Right.
tricky. But somebody who has a really rich experience working with many people might actually have valid anecdotal evidence or experience that maybe hasn't been studied in a research context or can't be studied in a research context. What's tricky is that our ability to discern um, scientific fact, or maybe scientific
Mm-hmm.
isn't the right word, but we're biased. So we tend to
Exactly.
see things that we want to see, and our anecdotal evidence might not be as rigorous. For example, let's say I had success with 3 people doing one thing and 7 people it didn't work for. Well, I might more easily forget the 7 people that the thing didn't work for
Yeah.
and remember better. Oh, or another example would be like recency bias. So I
Mm.
tried intervention X with patient, and the most recent patient it worked for. The other 5, the previous 5 it didn't work for. But I've forgotten about all of those because they were a while ago.
Exactly.
This person, it's most recent. Now this thing is the greatest thing. I'm gonna keep using it. I'm gonna tell everybody it works.
Thank you for mentioning and defining recency bias as well. Like all these biases, I think just becoming aware of the fact that our brain kind of operates, it's such natural for our brain to operate this
Yeah,
way. It's human nature, but the more we're aware of these tendencies, the more we can try to
that
recognize them
and
when they happen.
that's the most important thing. I think people are always on social media saying, I have so much experience. I've trained hundreds of people.
Yeah.
I'm well, like we said, I'm ahead of the research, or the research is too, the research in this is never as good as my own experience because they're not doing it the right way. But people fail to realize that they're subject to so many of these biases
That's
that they don't
right.
see things as clearly, which is why we do science, which is very well controlled, has a control group, for example, sets, randomization, sets a study up in a way that we can actually say that this, or with more credibility, say that this thing caused this outcome.
Right, because part of just the very nature of science is to try to eliminate bias as much as possible from the process. Like
Yeah.
it's like written into
Yeah.
the
And yeah, like when I do an intervention with a bunch of people and it works, well, there's so many other reasons that it could have worked. Could have worked because I told them it was going to work, and I believe that
Mhm.
it's going to work, and I got them to believe that it worked.
That's
And
right.
like that could be more powerful, like the placebo element of that,
Mhm.
than the like active ingredient in whatever the thing was that I was doing. And so afterwards I can look at it and say this worked with everybody, but it might not be
Because of
because
why you
of
think
the
it
thing.
worked.
Yeah. And so
That's
me
right.
recommending to other people that they do it, like they might not have
That
as strong a
same
belief in it, and it might not work for them.
That's so
So
true,
it's
Travis.
very tricky, and it might work. The other thing that people forget is, well, it worked for me and my clients, but I'm forgetting that I mostly work with professional basketball
Mm.
players or
Mhm.
famous
My gosh,
actors,
yeah.
and it's like, well, it worked for these people, but I'm not, and so I'm telling you to go use it with your people because it worked with all my people. But if you trained desk jockeys,
Mhm. Mhm.
people who are so different from the people that I train, it might not work. And that's
Absolutely.
just
And
not
these are the things you
often
can't.
included. So
Yeah.
yeah, like what I'm saying might be true, but it might not be true for you.
That's right.
Might
And
be
in your
true in my
context.
experience. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And that's like why we need science, right? Because you can on an anecdotal level work with 1,000 people, but if you use the same bias in all those 1,000 times, it's not really going to amount to much as far as like
Yeah.
actual
I think
objective evidence base.
people argue on the internet and like they're both probably right. And they're forgetting that
Yes, that's a
they're just
really
they're
good
not
point.
allowing for the possibility that they could both be right, because the arguments are totally different, but it's, well, are you recognizing that you and the people that you work with are very different?
Right, right. That's so, yeah, there's so many contextual factors, right?
Yeah.
So let's get back to our terms. We talked like talking about bro science leading to all of that. What is pseudoscience, which is another term that gets thrown around?
Pseudoscience would be anything that you believe or practice that is regarded as being based on the scientific method. So it seems like it's science, but it's actually not. So that's the pseudo aspect of it.
Yeah. Like it seems scientific, but it's not really based on scientific method.
Yeah. So, and that's hard for people who are not scientifically trained to be able
Right.
to separate that, because maybe they're using a lot of fancy words,
Mm-hmm.
or
That's a big
or
one.
maybe they have some good credentials that make it seem
Yes.
like they would be scientific, or any number of things. Maybe their science is bad. It's
Yeah.
based in faulty science. It seems like science, um,
Right. But
but
it's like
it's,
problematic.
yeah,
Yeah,
right.
totally. Yeah, and I feel, for example, we've talked a bit about like physical therapy in this conversation, and we know there's major discussions these days about trying to update physical therapy. So, what do you think about like physical therapy? To me, feels like that's a scientific field based on science, but maybe within physical therapy there could be some pseudoscience within physical therapy. Like if we're
Yes,
thinking about these
for
terms and
sure.
like,
Yeah.
right?
People who are using treatments that just don't have good evidence, but then
Right.
maybe claiming that they have good evidence.
Yeah, because they're cherry picking, maybe, which that's a
Sure.
term to maybe talk
Yeah.
about, is like
Which is
one.
still, yeah, related to pseudoscience, but cherry picking would be a little bit more scientific than
Hmm.
pseudoscience, because you're at
That's
least
true.
relying on science. You're just doing a bad job of it. By on
Yeah,
Cherry picking is using only the research that supports your position.
that's right.
So there could be 100 studies out there showing that stretching doesn't prevent injuries. But if you find 3 studies that show that it did, you can just pull those out, put
Hmm.
those in your reference list, and exclude all the
And there
other
you
ones. And
go.
if somebody doesn't know about the other 97, then they could be persuaded. But the only
Right.
reason that they were persuaded is because you cherry picked. And whereas the correct process would be to go through all 100, recognize
Yeah,
that there are 97 that say that it doesn't, and then be fully honest and transparent about what the body of evidence says.
that's
But
right.
that's not as easy as finding 3 studies on Google Scholar that support you and running with that.
That support your opinion. Yeah, support the belief you already have. Would you say that cherry picking is a practice that just it's kind of related to something called confirmation bias?
Yeah,
Would you
yeah.
say those
So
two are kind of
yeah,
related?
if I believe want to believe that stretching prevents
Hmm.
injuries, then I can find 3 studies. You can find a study to support
Hmm.
anything. So if
Right.
that's the belief because somebody told me that it worked for me, it worked for me and a few other people, then I can find some evidence that confirms that bias, confirms my belief. I can cherry pick some studies. I can go on Google Scholar, find a few studies that show that, cite them, and then proliferate these incomplete or wrong narratives.
Precise. Yeah. Yeah. And it's just easy to do because if you have a belief that you want to believe, it's just easier to go out of your way to pull
Yeah.
out the evidence that supports you and just ignore the evidence that doesn't because
Yeah.
of like motivated reasoning and confirmation. It's just like it's human nature, right?
Yeah. And even worse, let's say that cherry picking, you've at least found a few examples to support your narrative. There are even worse things where you're just randomly pulling studies that sound like they might have something to do with the claim that you're making, knowing that people aren't going to go look at them, putting them there to justify your thing. Maybe you're even dumping a laundry list of citations that are tangentially related to your claim, but don't actually support your thing. But you're like, well, nobody's going to look. I've included so many studies that nobody's going to actually look them up.
Anybody can put anything on Google, right? Like just anything out there. And if you throw a bunch of citations at the bottom that just on the surface look like they're sort of related, most readers will be like, okay, this person must know what they're talking. Like it's just a way of kind of making it look like you're more credible.
Super frustrating to me.
Yeah. And we've
meticulously goes through and makes sure that the things that I'm citing are supporting the things that I'm saying.
Right. 100%. So that's kind of, it's good we're covering some of these things like confirmation bias and cherry picking. Another, maybe while we're talking about some terms, I feel like a couple of there are things called logical fallacies that I know, I don't think they're like the end all be all, but I know that when I, and as I continue to learn to be more of a scientific thinker, logical fallacies, learning about them really helped me. Because I could start to see them in things I would say. And now that I know them a little better, when I see them in other people, I'm just like, they're not actually making an argument. That's just a logical fallacy.
Yes.
And there are a ton, and you can actually be like quite an expert on logical fallacies. And I'm not, I just like on a superficial level, have some familiarity with some of the common ones. So I thought maybe we could talk about some. There are some that I, in the yoga world specifically, see a lot that I think our listeners will relate to.
Well, I think the ones that you're going to point out are very common in
good
spheres.
Okay, so what's the first one on our list for logical fallacies?
Appeal to authority.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what we've been
talking
about with our own experience.
That's right. We both trusted.
When you went out and taught based on that paradigm, and even when you were questioned, you were like, well, that's not right because so-and-so told me. Yeah, and they're an authority. I view them as an authority.
That's right.
Because of whatever, because they're self-proclaimed or because they have credentials.
They started a system with a 3-letter or whatever. Right. They like own the system that certifies you. So you're like, well, they're my authority. But it's like, maybe we could start to think to look beyond that. Like just because someone starts a system or whatever does something to make you see them as an authority, can they also be fallible? Can they also be wrong?
They can.
I think they can, and they are quite frequently.
Yeah, I think everyone should be questioned.
Everyone should be questioned.
Yeah, like no one is beyond question because of any of those reasons. Whether they have a PhD or a doctorate in physical therapy or wrote a blog post or wrote a textbook or wrote a research paper or published hundreds of research papers. Like nobody's beyond questioning.
Being questioned. That's right. And I think, and maybe this gets a bit into like kind of just our list of takeaway tips for people for how to like tune into, whether a source may be reliable or not, or someone to trust. But a really good indicator is like, well, how open are they to being questioned? And when they're questioned, are they defensive and they just don't want to hear it? They deflect,
they appeal to their own authority. Who I am?
Yeah, exactly.
I wrote the book on this.
And I think that also leads me into the point that people who have a financial interest in the beliefs that they're sharing, if there's like a financial connection there, they're inherently going to have a bias because, it's in their interest to keep these beliefs going.
We might even refer to that in the science world as a conflict of interest.
Yes, a conflict of interest, right?
Yeah, where they're profiting on the proliferation of these narratives. So when questioned if that would hurt their bottom line, they're going to be less likely to entertain the counterfactual.
That's right.
Alternative idea.
That's right. So just inherently, like someone who starts a 3-letter system, they're going to have a financial investment in like what they're teaching within that system being correct. And so that's just another yellow flag, I think, to look for. Like one red flag is when people are not open to being questioned. One maybe yellow flag, maybe it's a red flag, is if they have a financial investment in.
Yeah, I think it's a yellow flag. I think that it's possible to be.
Yeah.
What would the alternative to be? It's possible to be open to being questioned and entertain alternative possibilities than the one you're providing even if you're making money off of something.
That I think
I
you're
hope.
right. I mean, yeah, that makes sense to me. So appeal to authority, that's one logical fallacy, like saying something is right because an authority said it, right? Another one that I found big time in the yoga world is appeal to tradition.
Right.
What's that, Travis?
That is when you might be questioned and you say, but well, we've always done it this way, or it's always been done this way. And that is even more powerful when you talk about a movement practice that's been around for a really long time, that is steeply rooted in tradition.
That's right.
But it's the case. It can be the case. You can appeal to tradition passed down through generations of lineage or whatever, but you can appeal to your own tradition of, well, I've always done it that way. And that's
true.
So they're both problematic, but it's probably even worse if you're just relying on your own tradition, because that's like, just because I've done it all this way forever doesn't
mean that's
right.
The optimal way, just because you've been doing it. Yeah.
And that's like the easiest one to justify, like outdated treatments in rehab. It's like, well, we've always done it this way. And it's just like, well, you might be too lazy to change.
Totally, to go out of your way to like update.
Or, and it gets into like, well, we've always done it this way and we believe that it's working well. Have you ever taken the time to actually test that assertion? Or are your colored glasses, your tradition colored glasses, making you see something that because you want it to be there because it's easier not to change?
It's just easy. Yeah. Maybe it's worked in some like mediocre way, but could there be a more optimal way that you just haven't looked for? Yeah. In the yoga world, I find a lot, and the statement in and of itself isn't necessarily even accurate, but just like, yoga is this amazing practice that's been around for 5,000 years. So like what we're doing today is so powerful because it's been practiced for 5,000 years. So that leads to a whole, we won't talk about it today too much, but like the yoga that we do today isn't really 5,000 years old anyway. It's like only about 100 or so. But in general, just that like appeal to tradition, like yoga is extra good because people have been doing it for 5,000 years. That would be a logical fallacy.
Mythical
Or acupuncture is like really effective because people have been doing it for centuries. There's that. That's a very common one.
It's just not a good reason.
That's not a good, exactly. It's not a good reason, right? So that's appeal to tradition. I think that's a good one to. What's next on our list of logical fallacies?
Appeal to nature.
What's that? Appeal to nature. And I find this very widespread in yoga, but just the wellness industry in general. It's just these ideas, and this was very steeped in that alignment training that I took. It was very much like we need to be like hunter gatherers and be like in our natural state. But it's basically this idea that appeal to nature. It's like things that are natural are just better just because they're natural. Right? Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, totally. So can you give an example?
It's not natural to sit in chairs. Like our modern society. So instead we should all like squat. Like that's squatting is a natural movement. In fact, there are like systems of movement that are like natural movement. That was actually a big part of that alignment training I took, but there are others out there too. They're just like, this is the way you should naturally move. And like yoga, there'll be these like, people fearmonger or negatively talk about yoga because yoga involves like non-natural or unnatural movements. In whatever, however they're determining what's natural and what's not, but sorry.
I thought you were going to say like the introduction of props, like that's not natural.
Oh,
would that be an example, or is
that's a really good? I could see thinking that from the outside, but I have not experienced.
What would be a maybe
more pure? Movement? I think like in my Ashtanga past, it was definitely props were looked down on. Not, I don't think I would say natural, but it was just more like that wasn't pure. It's just you. Maybe that is appeal to nature, Travis. Maybe. And I just hadn't thought about that before.
But then again, like you're using a yoga mat. It's not
right. You are using a mat.
Like a synthetic.
That's right.
So would an example be like practicing handstands?
Yeah.
Like that's not a natural movement.
That's not you wouldn't walk. We don't walk on our hands. We walk on our feet. Yeah. So why would you do a handstand? We don't stand on our hands. Or, just like a lot of like end range positions. I don't know, certain like arm binds in yoga, like things that just people would just look at that from the outside and be like, I wouldn't have done that as a hunter gatherer. or if I lived in nature. So that's got to
Wow.
be bad. That's an unnatural. I only want to do like squatting and whatever they
Yeah.
perceive to be natural movements.
Interesting.
That's like in the movement world, but don't you think too, like in like the nutrition world, like there's just a lot.
Oh yeah. Anything natural is better
hmm How
than
many products
anything.
do we see in the
Yeah.
grocery store? All natural.
Yeah.
But aren't
Yeah.
there
They're,
things that
they're
are
appealing to that.
aren't there things that are natural that are actually dangerous and bad for us?
For sure.
Like lots,
I mean,
right?
yeah, there's like berry trees outside my house where the berry, like, you're not supposed to eat those, right? Well,
That's
it's
right, but they're
natural.
natural,
Yeah.
right? An example I've seen given before is like apple seeds, which is just similar to what you just
Oh
said, but
yeah.
like you're not supposed
You're
to
not
eat
supposed to eat
apples,
those. Yeah,
right?
or at
And
least not too many of them.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, they're supposed to be bad for you. I also read an example of like murder. Technically, murder is like natural because it happens in the natural world. So, like, we should be able to like murder, just because like
Yeah,
these are
why not?
counter examples to show like why appeal to nature is a logical fallacy. Because
Right, right.
just because something is natural doesn't mean that it's good. Like, it's just not a good
Uh-huh.
reason to use for a justification for something.
Exactly.
Okay. That's appeal to nature. Did we have any more on our list?
I think the next one is
Oh,
really
yeah.
good. We
Yeah,
had the post hoc fallacy, which we've talked about this
we
already.
have.
Like,
Like on other episodes.
well, even in this one, like when I gave the example of personal trainer uses a certain intervention with many people, it
Right.
they think it works, and because the intervention preceded them feeling better, that or whatever, got the outcome. They did the intervention, the people got the outcome that they wanted. Therefore, it must have been the intervention that caused the
Yes.
thing because
Yes.
the intervention came before the outcome. But there
Right.
could be so many other reasons why a person is getting an outcome. And this is especially true in the rehab world where you're delivering an intervention and it seems to be, well, they got better because we gave them acupuncture or whatever. It's like, well, they might have gotten better just because 8 weeks passed.
Exactly.
so
Right.
it's
That's right.
very difficult to
Like they
say
just healed on
they
their
got better
own.
because of this. But
Yep.
when it's very easy to like observe that we that's a bias, like we're observationally biased towards thinking, well, this came before this, therefore
This caused
what's
this.
what ergo proctor, if the what's that stand for?
Yeah, what is it? It's
There, it's
like
Latin,
it
but
happened
it,
after this, so it happened
yeah,
because of this. Isn't that right?
yeah,
After this, therefore
exactly.
because of this. I think that's what
That's
post hoc
exactly it.
ergo propter hoc translates to. After this,
Exactly.
therefore because of this.
Right. And that's just things can happen for so many other
So
reasons.
many other
Time
reasons.
or expectation bias or placebo or whatever
So
that you
many other
can't
things.
necessarily say unless it was a scientific, like a well-controlled scientific study that this caused that.
100%. And I think that comes up a ton, like you said, in like personal training context, but I think especially in like physical therapy and in the rehab world and therapeutic, like massage therapy. Like I gave someone a massage and the next day they felt better in their pain. Like it could have been specifically the massage strokes that you did in that moment. It could have just been the person relaxed for an hour. It could have
Right.
been that you told them what you were doing was going to make them, like you
Yeah.
give
Or
us
it
lots
could
of
have been
examples, but
that the passage of that day without the massage.
they could have not had the massage and still felt better.
Yeah.
That's right.
So
And
that's
that's the
why we need to be very careful with our observation and drawing conclusions, stating evidence,
mhm.
deriving evidence from our own observations because our observations are biased.
That's right. Exactly. It's just so easy to make that post hoc fallacy, which I think a good example that I read before to just show how that's like a faulty reasoning is like, and I'm sure maybe you've heard this one before too, Travis, but like the rooster crows right before dawn and then the sun rises.
Oh
So
yeah.
therefore we should think, well, the rooster crowed and that's what made the sunrise, right?
Yeah.
So if we look at that, we're like, we don't think that when we look at the rooster and the sun. We're just like, the rooster just crows as the sun rises or whatever, or right before. So we can see these counter examples to start to see where, well, in another
Right.
context, something happened and something happened after. It doesn't mean it was because of
Yeah.
that.
So why are we believing this in a yoga context?
Yeah,
or whatever.
exactly. Or what, or yeah, exactly. Um, what about this one? I had this on the list and I actually just saw something on social media today that reminded me of this. This one's ad hominem.
Hmm.
Ad hominem. This is another, I think this is a logical fallacy.
Yeah,
Yeah, ad hominem.
I think
So,
so too.
what's that?
That's when you attack somebody.
You
Is that
attack
right?
the person instead of their argument, right?
Oh,
Isn't
right,
that
right,
what
right.
that is?
I was missing that crucial aspect.
Right. It's
Right.
like you're in a
So
disagree, you're in a debate or whatever,
yeah,
and you don't attack what they're saying, you just attack them as a person.
right.
And
And
I don't
that's
know.
problematic.
Yeah, because then you're not talking about the substance of what they're saying. You're just trying to bypass that and just
Yeah,
like take the person down as a person. And I feel like I see
right.
that happen a lot in like internet
Totally.
debates.
It's very easy to make it personal, but
Yeah,
we when we're debating, we want to stick to the facts. And a related
exactly.
one to that, and the last one that we can talk about is
Yeah,
the straw man
straw
fallacy,
man fallacy.
where you're attacking a position that the other person has not made. So usually
Yes.
it's an extrapolation. So if we said, what would be an example?
One that comes to mind is like we might talk about how alignment is really a
Oh yeah,
nuanced topic, and it doesn't bad alignment doesn't necessarily cause injury. Like it's more nuanced.
yeah.
Don't you feel like sometimes people strawman that and they say,
Alignment doesn't matter. Jenny said
yes,
that alignment doesn't matter. That's exactly the one that I was
that
hoping
you were
that
thinking
we would
of?
come up with. Yeah, but
Yeah.
couldn't think of it in the moment. So that's the one I wanted to bring up. Yeah. Anytime you say, like, this is a nuanced thing, well, the funny thing too is, like, if we say this alignment thing is nuanced, people who truly think that alignment doesn't matter will say, well, Jenny's saying that alignment is everything. And then people who think that alignment is everything are saying,
Right.
well, Jenny's saying alignment doesn't matter. Like, when you do take this like middle of the road, the people who with these at the other extremes will totally read the opposite of what you've said, or at least I've experienced that in
I
relation to
think
some of
that's,
the things that I tend to write about.
yes. And I think that maybe a way of understanding why this is called a straw man fallacy is because what you're doing is you're not actually taking what the person said and like trying to disagree with that. You're instead like it's like the stuffed man, a straw man that you're propping up. That's not actually who the person is or what they said, and you're attacking a straw like a fake thing that they didn't even say. I think when
Yeah.
I think about it that way, I think of like the scarecrow or whatever from Wizard of Oz, but just like a
Yeah,
straw
yeah.
man. Like I'm attacking that. I'm not attacking what's actually being said.
That's helpful for remembering.
Yeah, for remembering. Yeah, yeah. So people like to when they don't like hearing that like you and I might question these ideas about alignment, these black or white ideas about alignment. They want to just like not address that and not hear that by mischaracterizing what we say to
That's
say
perfect way.
something.
Yeah.
What'd you say?
That's perfect way of describing it. So then
Right.
they can say, she said this, that's crazy, and this is the
Yeah.
thing. And it's like, I never said that. But it's an easy way to, pit people against one another, or like help incite rage against you, because by falsely characterizing your beliefs.
Totally. And I've experienced that quite a bit. It's like they'll say like, "Well, you said this," and therefore, and then they go on this whole long thing about like all the reasons why I was wrong. But it's like, but you started off saying I said something I didn't even say. If you
There you go.
lead with the straw man, like I don't even need to read the rest of what you're. It's just like completely not. It's not an argument.
Yeah.
So straw man fallacy, yeah. There are many more. There are some really I find them kind of fun. So like the logical fallacies,
Oh
they're
yeah.
fun to
Yeah.
study and learn
Just
about.
hit up the Wikipedia page. There's a million of them.
Exactly. Just Google it. But if you like
The
learn about
ones,
them, you start to.
yeah, the one, but I think the ones that you pointed out are the ones that I find to be most just helpful, like in my day to day scrolling.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you agree. Yeah, they seem like the most relevant to like how all of us trying to navigate like all of this information that's constantly coming at us. I feel, Travis, like we've kind of covered kind of a lot of just some points for how we might like look twice at how we or look in a more discerning way about how we take in information in general and how to think a little more scientifically.
Uh-huh.
What about kind of turning to our list of just like tips that we would recommend for how people, how you might look at a source or a person that's sharing information, and how you may try to discern whether they're a trustworthy, more likely to be trustworthy or less likely to be trustworthy.
Yeah, let's do it.
And I know we've covered some of these already, for sure,
Sure.
but like we could just kind of, we could go through our tips and see how they land. Our first tip on the list that I think, again, it just kind of echoes so much, summarizes so much of what we've already said in this discussion, but is the person who's making the claim or sharing this information, are they like humble in the way that they share the information? Do they maintain like an air of doubt in what they're saying? Or are they super overconfident and just like, this is the way it is, and they're making like absolute claims?
Yep. Yeah. I This irks me to no end because we see it all the time. People
Mm-hmm.
overstating or being overly confident when they're just, it's way more gray, or
Yeah.
we don't know, and people make it out like they know, and it's a great way
Yeah.
to galvanize the troops and to get people to think, oh wow, this person's really smart, and I'm going to listen to them because they're
They're so confident.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
It's really easy, I think, to mistake confidence for like actual an actual understanding of the breadth of scientific literature on a topic.
Right.
But I think, yeah, actually, something that we didn't discuss that I wanted us to was that I think is related to this is the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Oh, right.
Right? Do you think that's like
Yes,
relevant here?
totally.
What is the Dunning-Kruger effect?
Dunning-Kruger effect is when you are very new to a subject matter. uh Maybe not very new. When you're very new, you realize you don't know that much, right? But
Right.
when you're a little bit new, but you've studied a little
Learned
bit,
some.
yeah, suddenly you think that you know a lot about that topic. And
Right.
that's where I was first coming out of personal training school. I was like, I just did 500-hour diploma program.
Right.
I know everything.
I'm
I'm
an
like ready
expert.
to take on the world here. Yeah. And then as you go on and learn more, you find out that there's so much more out there. And
Yeah.
suddenly you feel like, oh, I really don't know that much at all. I feel like I know
Yes.
nothing. I feel like, so that as I was getting my PhD, I was like, wow, I've studied swimming injuries for 4 years, and I feel like I know even less than I knew coming into this, because you've been made aware of everything that's out there. And that's
Right.
actually a good place to be in. It can feel like not a good place to be in because you feel like you know nothing. But when you've gotten over that actually knowing nothing to thinking that you know everything to realizing that you actually know nothing, that's a good place to be in, because you're actually more aware. And then over time you can learn more, but you know
Mm-hmm.
what you know and you know what you don't know, as opposed
Yeah.
to just this initial stage of the Dunning-Kruger effect where you what you actually know is very small, but what you think you know is very large. And that's very dangerous because you're
Yes.
very confident, you're outwardly displaying this confidence, and people might believe somebody who's very charismatic, when they
Mm-hmm.
actually
Charismatic and confident.
only know enough to be dangerous,
That's
because it
right.
makes it seem like they are very educated on this topic, but they have not actually gone over that valley and into the proper amount of knowledge and confidence in that knowledge that you get from being longer exposed into something.
Absolutely. I think that's so well said. And I like how you kind of delineated that. Like when you first learn about a topic, it's really easy to be like, now I know everything about this. But that when you learn more and continue to learn, you realize the huge breadth. It's not that it's not so much that you know nothing, or maybe that you could say that
Feels
loosely,
like
but
it. Yeah.
it's like it's more that you know what you do know and you know what you don't know. Like
Right.
that you said that. Like I think it's just that people who know a lot about the topic know what science doesn't know and know what questions haven't been answered, and that actually science has really just revealed just a small amount, and go
Yeah.
from
You
there.
still know the same amount, but you know
Yeah,
what the whole
right.
what's out
You know, the
there
bigger
so that you realize
picture.
what you don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, and, I don't know, when you were talking, it made me think of, Greg Lehman, who is someone we've had on the pod. You and I both really admire him and,
Yeah.
just his understanding of scientific literature on so many topics, and we had him on episode 5, the episode Stretching Myths and Stretching Facts, but something I've heard Greg Lehman say that helped me kind of understand this too was, that, like, the science on stretching is, like, so evolving, and really, like, in the big picture, not a whole lot is known. So anybody who's talking about stretching in a very confident manner probably doesn't really appreciate or understand the full body of scientific evidence.
There
Like
we go.
anyone who does would speak in much more hesitant terms, right? Which I
Yeah.
feel like he did, like when we talked to him on the pod, and when I hear him talk about that topic in general. But like we don't know a lot, so we've got to be kind of hesitant in what we say about what we do know. But then you have
Yeah.
people out there just on the internet who are just like, stretching will destabilize your joints and stretching will do that, just so confident and brazen.
Yeah.
And it's like, do they really know? Is that a
Right.
good source of information?
I would say not.
Right. Yeah, so the Dunning-Kruger effect seems like I'm glad I wanted us to talk about that. I'm glad we talked about
Yeah.
that here. There's also just this question of are they, and again, I think this is actually it's super similar, but do they embrace nuance and gray area and like the it depends approach in what they
Right.
say, or are they making just black or white statements like this is always bad for everybody, this is always
Yeah.
good for everybody?
Yeah.
So that's super similar, but maybe just a different way of wording
Yeah. So like
this one.
the answer to most questions is it depends. But if
Yes.
people aren't answering that way,
Then that might be a flag, a
right.
yellow or a red flag.
Agreed.
What about does the person or the source of information, do they update their message as they learn new information? And are they transparent about when they update their message and like why they updated it? Or do they just
Yeah.
like start talking differently, but they never owned up
This
to the fact
one
that they,
really grinds my gears because
I
I,
think I might
I
know.
well, yeah, two things on this. So I mentioned that I had many mentors who all came from the same school of thought, from a personal training, strength and conditioning
Mm-hmm.
standpoint. And the guru in that area, we won't name names,
I
but
think I know.
they prided themselves on updating their information or uh, allowing themselves to change their mind. So they were very they championed this message of, oh, you should be constantly evolving, oh, you should change your mind. Yet in
But then did they actually do
in the
that?
10 years that in the 10 years that I've been exposed to them, they've never changed their mind about anything.
Oh my
So
gosh. So it's one thing to
and continue
say
to
it, but
espouse
then to
very outdated
actually.
beliefs. Yeah, so it's ironic, I guess. But a good example of that, of being, so there's a 3-letter acronym that I was exposed to when I started out. I subsequently did a lot of research on it, and it did change its tune as research evolved, but was never transparent about it. Just said one
Mhm.
thing and then said the next thing and then said the next thing, and it became very confusing. It's like, well, what are they actually trying to espouse? Because they're goalpost shifting.
Shifting the goalpost. That's another
Yeah,
fallacy, right?
yeah,
Shifting the goalpost or changing
yeah.
the
Where
goalpost.
you just change the standard or the benchmark that you're measuring
Mhm.
something against, so that you can never be
So you
wrong.
stay right. Yeah.
Yeah, without coming out and being like, "Hey, we were wrong."
That's
And so
right.
it's
But
hard. It's hard to
man.
do that. It's hard
But
to
you know
admit
what?
that you were wrong.
Though I think the ultimate irony in all of this is what you just said. It's hard to be wrong. And what that means to me is that it takes strength to be wrong. Like if you can admit that you were wrong and that you changed your mind, that actually speaks well of you and your character, because you're going to have strength in what in your ability to
Yeah,
change and be not worried about what people think,
yeah.
as opposed to people who stick with the wrong idea, but just because they don't want to look wrong, so they just stick with what they
Don't
originally
want to look
said.
wrong. Yeah.
And
Or
that to me is not strong. That is
yeah.
someone who's actually weak, right? Like that's weakness. It's like I care
Yeah.
what people think of me too much that I can't look bad in
Yeah.
updating.
Yeah. Can't look bad, or have too much money invested
Yes.
in what I said before. Yeah.
I have another example that I think of when I think about this. So, in addition to the one that you shared about that organization updating their message, but not necessarily being transparent that they updated it, they just kind of kept moving forward as though they'd always said it. Another
Hmm.
place I've experienced this to be the case is in quote myofascial release, in the quote self myofascial release, I should say. So in the yoga world, there's definitely a big presence on like rolling on balls, for example,
Hmm.
as a means of like treating yourself or whatever in yoga. And when I first was taught and did trainings on myofascial release with balls, we were all taught that what the balls did was they like broke down fascial adhesions and like broke up scar tissue and just all like rehydrated your fascia. This was the terminology we were all taught and what I taught when then I shared those techniques in class.
Hmm.
And since that time, the science has become pretty clear, or maybe it was already clear by that time, but people are still teaching outdated info. But massage
Yeah.
and things like it, they work more on like a neurological level than on actually physically changing tissue.
Hmm.
So, and that's like the accepted evidence-based approach today. So what I've noticed is that these training systems that I had learned from that taught me the outdated stuff, I've noticed that they have shifted their language today. It seems like it's more about like let's roll on balls so that we relax, so that we quote reset our nervous system, like whatever that means. Things
Yeah.
like their language is more in the nervous system realm. I think because they probably finally heard or gotten enough feedback that they need to update. But
It's
never
good.
did I see them come out and say, there's new information since we started, our thing, or that we become aware of, and we're going to change our terminology. And to me that would have been really in integrity, like I'm going to own and be public
Yeah.
about changing this, but
It's
instead it in my impression
easier
it's
not
just
to do
slipped
it.
to now we're just going to
Yeah.
talk about it this way. But what
Yeah.
about all the people that you trained and certified in these outdated ways of talking about it? Like there was never communication,
Yeah.
to like their
Well,
trainees,
they
like we're
would be
gonna.
outraged,
Oh, the
right?
trainees would.
Yeah. Like, you just taught me all the wrong stuff. I want my money back. Like,
I know,
the certifiers can't do that.
but like you
They
and I
should.
talk. Right, they should.
Yeah.
I feel like if you frame it as just like I learned new information and I've updated, to me I feel like that would reflect on, oh, I admire that person for
I
going out of
agree.
their way to update. But I
Yeah.
could still see how it'd be frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, so like I
That's
feel
hard.
like that's a good sign of like it's a good sign. What would that be, like a green flag? I always hear about red and yellow flags, but not so much about a
Yeah.
green.
If you witness that, I think that would be like, oh, you know, I want to follow these people. They're
Because
updating they're
yeah,
transparently updating their messaging and
that's
owning
right.
up to when they weren't.
Yeah, that's just another good tip we think for helping to discern whether a source is trustworthy. Maybe we'll talk like a couple more here. I think another really good one, and one that I feel like we probably see a lot, is does the person or the source does the person stay in their lane
Yeah.
in what they're talking about? What do you think about that one, Travis?
I think that's really important because
That they
when
stay
you
in their
get
lane.
when you get fitness and yoga people talking about epidemiology and
Yeah.
vaccines,
Oh,
it's like I'm
that's
not
so
qualified to have an opinion
true.
on that. Sure, I have a PhD, but my PhD is in a very specific thing, and like
That's
I
right. Oh,
don't.
you're saying you are you when you say sure I have a
Yeah,
PhD.
or anybody. Yeah, anybody who doesn't have a PhD in epidemiology shouldn't be an armchair epidemiologist.
That's
So,
right. That's right.
or whatever, if you want to apply it the other way to yoga. So yeah, like yoga teachers shouldn't be expert be self-proclaimed experts in, I don't know, what's something that yoga
Um,
teachers sometimes
sometimes
feign
like
expertise
posture
in.
and pain, I feel like,
Sure.
alignment
Right.
and pain is a common one.
Right.
Like
Right.
I'm an
So like
expert on how you should align your body to avoid pain. Like
yeah,
that's not within the
that's
scope of a yoga. Like we don't treat pain as yoga teachers.
right.
Right? Yeah. So like, are they staying in their lane? Maybe another way of putting that is like, are they making claims that are out of their scope? Like, what's their
Right.
scope of practice, and are they staying within scope of practice?
Yes.
Right? Yeah, yeah. So sometimes it's, unless we ask ourselves that question, unless we step back and take a look, like what are their actual credentials and qualifications, and is what they're saying aligned with that, or are they stepping out of their actual, like
Yeah.
what they're qualified to talk about. So I think if we take a step back, sometimes that really clearly gives you whether it's a green or a red flag on whether
Yeah.
to trust someone.
Yeah. People just because they're smart, and they might be smart, but they might be allowing that smartness to, you know, uh, spill over into too many things that they really have no business having
Right.
an
That's so
opining on.
true. And thanks for putting it that way. Yeah. And I feel like that's very common, like just in the yoga movement, fitness, rehab, but just in general, in our society in general, just people,
Mm-hmm.
like you said, opining, popping off on something that they actually
Popping off.
don't really have the experience to be popping off
Yeah.
about. But then people don't know that. And especially if the person is like an influential person, if they're famous, or if they have a really large social media following, they just,
Yeah. It's
sometimes that
hard.
can
It's
cloud
hard
judgment.
because people ask your opinions on things, right? I'm sure you get that sometimes.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
like, well, you have a social media following, you are really smart, so I'm going to ask you about whatever. And then you're like,
Right.
I actually can't answer that question
That's
because
not
that's
within
not
my,
in my scope. Yeah.
I get a lot of, or I feel like fields. Although I think you're more, because of your rehabilitation scientist PhD, you're more qualified in the rehab realm. But I am not. As a yoga movement teacher, I get a lot of questions that people ask, like, what should I do about my SI joint pain? What should
Right.
I do
Right.
about
Right.
my back pain? And I think I've seen lots of examples of yoga teachers responding, saying, oh, you should do this, you should do that,
Oh, God.
like
Yeah.
all over the place.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, the funny thing too, even if you are qualified, so if you look sometimes on like PT forums, people
like
will like
physical therapists, you mean?
physical therapy. Yes, people will bring in questions like, "Hey, I have a patient with this," and then you'll
Mm.
get 100 different replies with 100 different three-letter acronyms. Do this because I learned this, and it's like nobody
Right.
even ever saw this person and assessed
The
them.
actual client
So
or patient.
yeah, yeah, just diagnosing things
Oh,
on the internet, even if you are qualified, is like a
that's a
no-no.
really good point, Travis. That's a really good point, because
So
ultimately it's about one to one,
anybody
right?
who's giving a really quick, like, oh, do this,
Oh,
try this acupuncture, it's like,
yes. Change your alignment. Stretch your hamstrings, because your tight hamstrings are
yeah,
causing your back
yeah,
pain. Like, so it's just all over the place.
yeah,
So anytime we see claims like that coming from, like these black or white claims about how to address some anonymous person's painful issue, to me, that's a red flag that they're probably not super evidence-based.
yeah, because they wouldn't be giving an answer if they were.
Yeah, the evidence-based answer is like, I'm not the right person to ask. Like, go, and you maybe refer them to someone who is. That would be really
Yeah,
helpful. Like,
yeah,
check in with this PT friend of mine or something.
totally.
Travis, we are just about at the end of our time here to talk about this excellent topic. We have covered a lot. I think some of the other things that we have on our list to offer as tips, we kind of have already covered.
Yeah,
Like, does the person cite references, and do the references actually say what the person says they do?
yep.
Do we trust someone just because they have a large social media following? Just things like that. Were there any final ones? I think we've already kind of talked about, just because someone has letters behind their name doesn't necessarily mean that they're just because a lot of, in the yoga world, they're PT, physical therapists / physiotherapists. They have the PT after their name. But within the field of physical therapy, we know there's a lot of outdated and pseudoscience. So it's like, you can't tell just by that the person is very evidence-based,
Yes,
right? Like, you can't tell just
agreed,
because they have that, right? I
correct.
think that's an important point to make. Oh,
Don't
what about?
trust somebody who doesn't believe. Don't trust somebody who has a belief that contradicts everybody else in the world.
Right. Oh, I see. That's a new point you're making. Yes, right. Because if they're like saying something that's just so cool, and we hear that a lot, right? Like so and so has this revolutionary new system or idea that blows everything else out of the water. Rarely can you trust anything that like one person on just like one day all by themselves came up with and then
Right,
started
right,
as a
right.
system. It's like that's probably not going to be very in line with the science.
Hmm.
Travis, should we trust someone just because they wrote a book
You could trust
alone?
us.
We could
We wrote a
we
book.
wrote a book, yeah,
No,
but
definitely
we don't
not.
trust
Anybody
this
can write a
because
book.
we. Oh my gosh, I see this one a lot in the yoga world. But just like, yeah, I believe this because this person wrote this book that I read in my yoga teacher training, But
Hmm.
I think it's helpful to point out that like like books are published by many people. There are tons of pseudoscience books. There are books about astrology. There are books about acupuncture. Like so just because there's a book doesn't mean that it's evidence based.
Yeah, yeah. And then one more
Yeah,
would
maybe this
be
will be our last
related to
one.
that. This will be our last one. Will be it kind of goes hand in hand with those people who are citation dumping,
Yeah.
but using really big, fancy
Oh,
sounding words
thank you for mentioning that.
to make themselves sound really smart. It
Hmm.
just, if you don't understand what they're saying, then there's a good chance that it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't make any sense.
Thank you so much for. I see that one a lot. Like, yeah,
Yes,
like someone just using
everywhere.
these quote technical sounding words that sound sophisticated. Then you just assume, oh, they must know what they're talking about because I don't understand those words, but they must. So then you believe them.
Hmm.
Don't you think like someone who knows a topic really well, like a key element is like if you understand a topic well, you can explain it in basic terms.
I do think
Do you think that's
that's.
true?
I do think so.
I think you are a really good example of someone who does that really well, just have to
Well,
say, in your
thank you.
education. Yeah.
I would offer that same praise to you.
Well, thank you. And maybe that's just a good, like, for just anybody who wants to teach anything, I think that's a good tip to think, like, well, am I able to teach it in a basic way that, like, most people could understand, or can I only talk about it in this really high leveled way?
Hmm.
Because, yeah, I mean, maybe they still understand it, but they just aren't able to communicate it, teach about it very well.
Yeah,
But also maybe they're just using gobbledygook and fancy sounding terms and they don't really know what they're talking about.
yeah. Or they're trying to. They might know what they're talking about, but they're trying to sound smart to try to
Yeah.
dupe you, to try to make themselves seem better than the rest, so that
Yeah.
you concentrate on them.
I think that's so true. Yeah. So it's just one side. It's like don't take someone's fancy sounding words alone as a sign that you should trust them. Like that's
Yeah.
not a good reason to trust someone just because they use words that you don't understand.
Yeah. And I like maybe even going so far as going the other way and being like, well, why can't they just use words that I understand? I'm going to ignore them.
Yes. Exactly. If they can educate and talk in a way that I can understand, that might be like a green flag. Like that's, maybe more likely to be someone that you might want to learn from.
Hmm.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that one. So maybe Travis, with that, we've kind of covered this semi thoroughly. This is a big topic. I know
Yeah.
I'm always continuing to try to learn and evolve in this realm for sure. I still have so much to learn, but thinking this way has really helped me kind of ascertain, like you said, the bullshit detector, right?
Right. Right. And I think the last thing that I want to reiterate, and I mentioned this earlier, like exposing myself to multiple viewpoints,
Oh yes,
like
thanks for
I
reiterating.
think that's the best thing that you can do is try to identify many sources of information and even conflicting sources of information. Don't just go all towards what you believe, because then you're never growing. So
Yeah.
trying to, even if you don't agree with what you're hearing, and that's a tricky one too, right? Like there are some people that I follow on social media because I disagree with them, because I want to be exposed to those things. And I think other people might take that as a sign that I support them, or that
Hmm.
I agree with them. And that's don't I would encourage people not to do that. But I hope that people don't look at the list of people I follow and say, well, that must be a credible person because he follows them. Like, that shouldn't be,
because that's not why you're following them.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that I would encourage other people to follow other people that they don't agree with, and maybe that they even strongly disagree with, just to get that exposure to hear another side. Whether you know that you're never going to agree with them, or whether you think, well, this person's saying something different from what I've heard before, but let me entertain this.
Like potentially let it be like a vehicle for questioning what you think, and maybe in questioning based on seeing what someone says, you just are reiterated in what you're just like, oh yeah, I can see more how that person is really, that's misinformation. But also it could be if you question and then you reflect, maybe that other information helped you learn something new. I don't know if I said that very well, but
be open-minded, but also be skeptical.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, expose yourself to varying points of view. We don't, it's not really helpful to get yourself caught up in an echo chamber. Right. And that's very easy to do.
Yeah.
That's very easy
even with your own beliefs, try to challenge those things. So before you just say one thing, think of all the other ways how what you think might be wrong. Do the full, try to argue from both sides, so you can make sure that whatever you're saying is bulletproof to the best that you can.
Yes, exactly. Always try to question what you're saying and look for the reasons why what you're saying might not be true.
Right.
That's like kind of what science does, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Science is the process of not proving things correct, but like trying to disprove ideas, right? Which is kind of the opposite of what people tend to think.
Yeah.
Do you think we can end on that?
Let's do it.
On that fine idea. Thank you so much, though, for having this conversation with me.
Thank you.